Greetings and welcome to the tree storage section of tree pruning. My name is Ron Perlik and I'm a mostly retired certified arborist. Been working with trees since the late 70s. And this presentation was originally designed for the Front Royal Power Company that we could present to them to help encourage proper tree pruning and understanding of how trees grow. The presentation was put together by myself, Ron Perlik, also David Means and Kerry Hulse. All three of us were members of the former Urban Forestry Advisory Commission for the town of Front Royal. We participated in for many years. And I would like to go ahead and present this to you so that you can benefit from the information that we gave them as well. Well, why do we prune trees anyhow? Many reasons, certainly. It's a necessary maintenance thing. Trees will develop deadwood over time. They'll sustain storm damage. They may have health concerns that require them to be pruned to maintain them in healthy condition and safety. And who plans the pruning? Who advises the pruning? The pruning is basically the responsibility of the person doing the work. Hopefully it's a certified arborist or a company under the realm of a certified arborist. Also the tree owner, which could be a private individual, could be a commercial owner or a municipal. Those are the three categories primarily of tree ownership. So we want to do pruning for many reasons. As trees are growing, they're going to develop on their own, but sometimes they don't develop structure properly. So an arborist will come in and identify structural issues and recommend pruning practices that may mitigate that. You might want to raise clearance over sidewalks or streetways, parking areas, parklands where people are going to be walking and exercising, picnicking under the trees, present certain considerations for safety and also for just the general appeal of the trees. Health and aesthetics are among the other reasons that was my prune a tree. So, as I alluded to a few months ago, we want to create trees that are of sound structure. They're growing in a way that will help to promote them, by putting on wood that will be to its benefit, will make the tree stronger. We want to have a healthy tree, certainly. That's going to mean removing dead branches would be a major thing about health. Also, you may want to prune a tree to open it up a little bit, let a little more air through it, reduce the likelihood of mold developing, bacteria and such that might be on the tree. And we certainly want to be prudent about what we remove. We don't want to take too much out of the tree at one time because, of course, the tree is using the leaves to create food for it. And we don't want to take out too much of the leaf area at one time. Also, we want to protect the bark of the tree. If too much leaf area is taken out, then it can possibly get too much sun on the trunk or branches of the tree and create a situation called sunny scald, which actually damages the tree. So we're talking about pruning trees and the various reasons that we do this. You can prune a tree at any time during its life, but ideally, you would like to start the pruning when the tree is young. So you can develop what's called the scaffold branches, the scaffold branching, the structure of the tree and the silhouette and the various aspects of it like that. So starting in the nursery, if you have an opportunity, it's really the best place to start your pruning. You want to check a tree from time to time and see how it's doing. If you're having issues develop, like maybe a branch is breaking or you're starting to develop cross branches, things like that. And at that point, then you can look at ways to deal with those defects and help mitigate them. And again, we don't want to take out too much material. We don't want to create stress or defects by our pruning also. And I'll show some examples of proper and improper pruning in a few minutes to exemplify that point. So, what's wrong with pruning? Well, in general, pruning is good, but like anything else, you can have too much of a good thing or too much of a thing that becomes bad. So like I was mentioning before, an example of sun scald might be an example of pruning on a short-term need. You wanted to open up the tree to let more light in the yard or rates of branching up a much higher rate than might be necessary. Without considering the effect of the health of the tree is also an important thing. And you go, well, what can happen to the tree by pruning it? Well, depending on the time of year, it may or may not be appropriate to prune that particular species of tree. And one of the reasons would be that there are always bacteria, viruses in the air, and pathogens that can injure a tree when you create a fresh wound. And it's helpful to know what trees are susceptible to what types of influences so that you can time your pruning properly. Oftentimes, the dormant season is good to do that because these other factors are not a problem. And you don't have the insect activity that also might be attracted by fresh pruning cuts. And also pruning without considering how the tree will respond. Well, pruning can result in the tree putting out water sprouts or shoots on the branches. And you have to consider, is that going to be a problem or not? And part of that is resolved by making proper pruning cuts. Again, we're leading you up to that discussion in a few minutes. And this last line is something I like. We combine the art of pruning with the science of tree biology. So that takes into effect understanding how trees put on response would to injuries, and pruning is an injury. So how is the tree going to respond to the injury? Also, as a professional arborist, I got involved in many tree removals. So one of the aspects of that beyond biology and the pruning aspect was mechanics and physics and understanding working loads and things like that. So it really stimulated me on many levels. I'm still jazzed about it. All right, so trees typically grow in a couple of different environments. We'll just, broadly define them as forest trees and landscape trees. So forest trees grow in a wooded setting. They grow in groups of various sizes, but generally they are unkempt, as it were. They're not managed in the terms of pruning. Forest trees may, in commercial setting, be managed for timber, but they're generally not pruned or worked on the same way that a landscape tree will. And forest-grown trees, because they're typically in a tighter community, tend to grow with less material on the lower parts of the trunk, and the canopy is up higher. So you kind of get a big umbrella effect in the forest. And the trees in the forest also have different levels of dominance. Trees that accept certain amounts of light and others that require more light. And if the ones that require a lot of light are down in the understory, they're not going to survive. So it's a matter of the forest kind of managing itself in that way. But landscape trees, on the other hand, we're certainly all familiar with them, will tend to grow in a much more open fashion. Their canopies will be broader. They may not have as much of a vertical tendency as a forest-grown tree because they're getting their light from the fuller canopy that they have. Also, another thing about landscape trees is they're more likely to form codominant stems. And no, this is not an S&M thing. This is the way trees grow. So we'll talk about that in a few moments also. But that's a very important thing that we want to address and understand what they are and how to deal with them. So now we're starting to get into that biology part that we were talking about a few moments ago. And trees, most people understand, some of the basics about trees. Well, trees have roots, they have trunks, they have bark, they have branches, they have leaves, they have fruit. Well, let's look at the mechanics of it, how the tree grows and how branches are attached in this case. And this illustration will guide us in our pruning efforts a little bit later on. There's a branch bark ridge. It's a feature that is between the main stem and a branch that might be bisecting off of it. And the branch bark ridge is an area of compressed tissue where the vessels are gathering together, and it makes this little raised area in here. And you can see right in there is a branch bark ridge, and this is going to be the union of the branch there. So that helps to guide us where we want to prune, and we'll talk about that. So another neat thing about trees is that trees actually have defense mechanisms of their own that helps them defend against decay. And a gentleman named Alex Shigan, who worked for the Forest Service in New Hampshire, was one of the pioneers in studying how trees respond to wounding. And I'm excited to have been able to benefit from his knowledge. He really came to awareness in people in the tree care industry back in the 70s, 80s, which was when I was developing my career and my business. So it was really wonderful to learn these newer concepts about how trees respond to wounds. And Alex Shigo actually had a grove of trees that he planted, and he took a chainsaw and he created wounds, and he studied how trees responded to these wounds. So neat stuff. The protection zone. He saw that from his studies. He came up with a model called CODED, which is the compartmentalization of decay in trees. And that also helps to guide us where to cut and to expect what kind of reaction the tree is going to have to a wounding that we do to it, or one that happens naturally. We talked about the codependent stems. One of the other things about them is they don't have a protection zone, so they don't have that chemical barrier that's as strong that helps to prevent decay. And there are also some physical problems about them also, which we'll get to. So here you can see where the decay has been stopped by this new tissue that's grown, and also by the internal walls, the cold walls, where the tree puts up these chemicals and resists decay. Pretty amazing stuff. And this is the kind of thing that Shigo did. He would take a tree and he would cut it longitudinally like this, and then look at how the various tissues were in relation to each other. So again, we talked about the chemical production helps sealing up the branch, and pretty neat stuff. So we do not want to remove or damage this stone when pruning. Thank you very much, because the tree is doing its own thing better than we can in many cases to protect itself. So codominant stems, we talked about that. We kind of got you jazzed up about the thoughts about that. Well, codominant stems are branches or stems, rather, I guess, that kind of compete with each other. They tend to be about the same size. And one of the problems with them is that they make these V-shaped forks or V-shaped crotches. And a V-shaped crotch is not as strong as a U-shaped crotch. The U-shaped crotches, the tissues connect better. In this case, it's possible for these two stems to separate and create a major wound. And I've seen it many times. I think some of you have seen it also at various of our field journeys. So they're not actually attached to each other. And curious thing, I'm going to tell a few stories as we go along here. I had a client call me in for a consultation. They had a small tree in their yard. They said it had been hit by lightning. And they wanted me to confirm that, because the insurance company would not pay for taking the tree down if it had been damaged by other means. And I looked at the tree and identified predominant stems. And I also identified this area below where the opening is, and the trunks were against each other. There was no bark in there. It was actually blackened. And the client swore that they saw the tree hit by lightning. Well, being a respectable arborist, I had to speak my opinion, which didn't agree with the client's desire, and as a result, they were not happy with my diagnosis. But that was what it was. So I didn't send them to school to learn about predominant stems. They had to do that on their own. So, all right, no production zone. And here we go again. So we talked about the V-shape, and it's got a feature called included bark, which is where I was saying that they kind of touch each other, but they don't fuse, as opposed to this U-shaped junction. And you can see the branch or the stem bark ridge in this case, and they are similar in construction. So again, V, not good, U, good. And here are a couple examples of branches that are going to be pruned. Ideally, you don't want to prune a side branch that's more than a third or a quarter of the size of the parent stem. It creates a smaller wound that way, and you're not taking out as much leaf material. All right, so how do we go about this? Now, what do we do to prune a tree? Well, we use a saw generally, and You may have a saw like this in your garage or in your workshop, and it works great on cutting firewood or cutting lumber. But these tools are not designed for pruning large trees. So the bow saw is kind of unwieldy, and the teeth are very large. And then the handsaw, again, trying to cut a fresh tree with it, those teeth are all going to gum up, and it's not going to work. So we have solutions to that. We have pruning tools. These are going to be for cutting smaller branches or stems, and they're quite handy. However, there are two different kinds, and you want to select the proper one for the type of work you're doing. So you're probably going to be cutting dead wood or live wood. And this one at the top is called an anvil pruner because the cutting edge goes against what's called the anvil, that flat section there. And that's good for cutting the dead wood, and it's not so good for cutting grainy wood, live tissue, because it will crush one side of the branch when you're cutting with it. So in that case, we have some other options. We have the bypass pruner. And in this case, instead of the blade coming down against an anvil and cutting that way, it's like a pair of scissors where two sides overlap and they cut that way. And it's going to leave a much nicer cut, and it's going to be better for the tree also. Okay, so we looked at the long saws. Here's some examples of better saws. In this case, the hand pruning saw, which has fine teeth also, but it's designed to cut with a pull stroke, which is really handy because you can use your energy to pull and make your cuts that way. And they're also slightly curved, so it also makes it a more aggressive cut and easier on the person that's using it. There's this combination tool. I personally don't care for it because it's cumbersome. You can't work in tight spaces with it. But if you're a homeowner that only has a few trees or working on small things and you don't want to go invest in a professional pole pruner type of a tool, then this combination unit may be satisfactory for you. We do not recommend using any tools with aluminum or metal handles or portions on them if you're working close to electrical conductors, and that could include electrical conductors, of course, but also you have to be aware of communications conductors and other things that might possibly conduct electricity that could be harmful to the person that encounters it. So, many ways of cutting. We're going to talk about removal cut, and this is probably the one that we're going to use most frequently. It's going to be taking off a smaller portion of even the larger branch or larger trunk of the tree. And the nice thing about it, if you're doing it properly, see the branch bark ridge there has been maintained, and the cut is made just outside of the swelling area. So that swollen area is also another biologically important part of the tree where it's putting in the defense chemicals. So you don't want to avoid hitting avoid cutting the branch bark ridge and also that tapered area, that swollen section. So you can see there's the branch bark ridge right there, quite prominent. The cut is outside of the branch bark ridge, and it is outside of the swollen area there too. So all of the chemical defense mechanisms are able to work properly in that case. And here we've got a dead branch, and then you can actually see the swollen area quite well here. And the branch bark ridge itself is not as prominent, but in this case, that swollen area is really going to be your greatest area of concern anyhow. What you want to do is, that's a fairly good sized branch, so you're going to use a particular method to take that off so that it doesn't tear down and damage the tree, called the 3-cut method. And we always like to have you waiting for something just a little bit more. So we'll talk about the 3-cut method coming up. But we wanted to show you this. So you use the 3-cut method to take the larger part of the branch off, and then when you have a stub, you'll cut just outside of this area here so that you're not nicking that wood and creating a new wound area. So again, you can see how a properly pruned tree will grow a circle around it, almost uniform. The ones that are not properly cut are going to have this like a toilet seat sort of appearance to them. It's thicker on the sides, thinner on the bottom. So that looks like that's probably what's called a flush cut. which is cutting too close to the trunk. And flush cuts used to be kind of common practice, but this is one of the things that Alex Saigo studied, and we learned that cutting outside of that branch collar is the safest thing so that you don't create these poor wounds. Wound dressing. When I started in the business in the late 70s, wound dressing was a common thing. We had little paint pots on our saddles, with a little brush, and unscrew it and paint the wound and put it back on. And if there was something that you couldn't reach that had a little, what's called a bail, sort of a slot on the handle that you could stick the handle over your pole saw blade, reach up with your pole saw and make your cut up in the tree. And after a busy day of pruning and painting cuts, you would come home with black paint in your hair maybe, and on your uniforms or whatever. So I, for one bank, was not sad to see the use of pruning paint go away. So here again, looking at our branch ridge or branch collar and the proper placements of the cut. And in cases where you don't have a visible branch collar, then you can kind of estimate from the angle where that's going to be and then stay outside of that area. Oh boy, we talked about pruning being done for years and years and years. There's good pruning and there's not good pruning. Well, I have a little section in my computer where I store pictures of bad pruning and that it's labeled arborist. So these are some examples of arborist. Here's a tree that was, number one, it looks like it's cut into that swollen area, and it did not use the three-cut method, so when the branch broke, it tore underneath it, and that's opening more area to possible infection for the tree, so not good there. This one on the right, another situation where the branch was not properly cut before the final cut, and it just ripped down that branch. And again, that's going to be a large area of what's called an infection port, an area where disease, insects might be attracted to it. And then on the right, bang, blazing example of a flush cut. You can see the difference in the appearance between that and the one on the branch, which is closer to being correct, probably not still quite right. And then the one up above it is a little bit closer to correct. That's flush cut. Huge, just takes a long time for the tree to grow over. And trees don't heal. We heal. Animals heal because we have skin that puts new cells, and the old cells fall off when a wound is healing. Well, trees don't do that. They grow new tissue over the wound. So the terminology we use now is wound response with it. It's not healing, it's responding to the injury. You can use that to sound a little more educated when you're talking to an arborist and comes to look at your trees now. Wound response with it. Okay, so thinning cuts. We do not want to rip those branches. Remember I talked about the three-cut method? Hey, we see numbers here, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, this is it. So in order to help reduce the likelihood of branches stripping down and ripping the bark and other wood, we use a method where we take off the larger portion of the branch by using 3 cuts. So first cut's going to be an undercut away from where your final cut's going to be. You'll make that in maybe about a third of the diameter of the branch. Be careful, don't go too far, because if it's a big branch and has weight to it, that branch is going to come down and it's going to pinch your saw. And then you're going to have a problem. You're going to have to get that saw out some way, or you're going to have to make a cut further out to free the saw. So about a third of the way in, maybe a quarter to a third for the first cut. Second cut comes out a few inches past where the first cut is made, and you go ahead and cut down at that point, and eventually the tree will break right in here, and it will, a term for that they used to use when I started out called the jump cut, because it actually can make the branch fall kind of flatter as opposed to dangling down and then tearing off. So that jump cut helps protect what's still attached to the tree. And in some cases, you might want to be able to direct where the branch falls because you might have some void on the ground, a roof, or who knows what. any situations like that. And then the third cut is the one that brings you back to the branch ridge is still maintained, and then the tapered area there is still maintained. And here's your final example right there. Okay. We don't want to leave stubs. Alex Shivo used to call it candy for the insects and diseases. So you want to get close to this tapered area because that's an area of rapid growth, and it will eventually go over that wound if the tree is healthy and the cut's not too big. Okay, thinning cuts. Again, we don't want to get that flush cut going. See, it's cut through the branch ridge and through the tapered area there, collar. And it's just, it makes me sad when I see. Not good. So reduction cuts. In this case, this is a way to reduce the tree or make it smaller. We'll talk about topping a little bit in a few moments. And folks have probably heard that term used. Actually, it is still used in advertising by some companies that are not familiar with the harm topping does, or fortunately, some of them don't care. They'll just do whatever the client wants so they can put money in their pocket. It's not an ethical thing. So instead of topping, we have an alternative called reduction cuts. And what we're doing is we're basically removing certain material. We're cutting back to a branch or back to the trunk in some cases. Again, we want to use this 1/3 rule where the part that you're taking off should be no more than a third of the size of the parent stem that it's going to be staying. And again, that's to help so you don't make too big a cut, and also so you're not taking too much material off that the tree needs to keep living. Okay, so small reduction cut, really don't see that much in that, but basically there was probably a branch that was going up and they've done a reduction cut to open it up a little bit there. There might have been a conflicting branch developing there. Okay. And here you can see where they're using some examples where they might do that. The reduction cut can also be used to help develop the structure of the tree. You can influence the growth of a single dominant stem, and that can be very helpful again for the tree structure. It might be helpful, say, if you have a tree that's close to a building or something where you want to kind of keep it away, you can use those types of cuts to also kind of thin the tree back a bit. So, looking at what they've done, this has been over the course of time, where they're showing taking out certain branches, and you're still maintaining the overall shape of the tree. This far one on the right shows you the development of that dominant stem. So we talked about structural pruning. You want to develop a second leader of the tree. If that particular tree has a habit of growing that way, many trees do not. They would be clustered trees, so you can't really prune them in that fashion. You have to take that into account of what it's called a habit. That's how the tree grows, its shape, its appearance. And in the case of a tree that has multiple stems, and you work that differently. Okay, heading cut. Well, this is what we know about the topic issue. Heading cut instead of a reduction cut. Well, heading cuts are bad because they're leaving that stub that we talked about. They could be an infection port. It's not going to be able to grow over that wound very well, and even if it does, it might collect water that will stay in there. So instead of taking this heading cut, you want to go back to the branch ridge and stay outside of that, cut it back there. Also, topping cuts can lead to superfluous growth, or what's called adventitious growth, where shoots like water sprouts, I mentioned a while back, will grow from the cut area. And those sprouts, not only are they unsightly, they take away from the form of the tree, but they also are weakly attached. So they could become a hazard because they're more liable to break off from wind or ice or other forces like that. So do not do heading cuts, do not top trees. Thank you very much. So reduction instead. Oh, another thing about the heading cut I forgot to mention. The reduction cut is made at the branch junction. The heading cut is done indiscriminately in between branches or in between what's called nodes, which are where branches develop to where buds come out. You want to cut so that you're leaving a node, like right here. Here's your node. All right, well, look at that. I think you don't have to know too much about trees to recognize that that's not a good thing. So we talked about infection reports. Well, here's a fungus that spores there all over that tree. It is not going to do well there. And eventually the tree, if it's healthy, otherwise we'll put up a defense system down in here somewhere, but it's going to go up into this one because it's going to be weak. And the defense system is going to be further down. Okay, so nodes. It's another term that you can put in your pipe and press people. Oh, what are you? Trust both the nodes, but not too far. Okay, so, and we talked about a tree that was close to a house or something. Well, cutting in this way also can influence the direction that the tree grows. So you may want to do that intentionally to pull it away from an object or flagpole, or in the case of utilities, they do that kind of pruning to bring it back away from the electrical conductors. And this is stuff that was more geared to the power guys. Well, I have to deal with that so much, but also you can create an opening for the conductors to go through by doing the reduction cuts, and then what I call directional pruning. And this is a tree here in town that we looked at and advised the power company on how to deal with getting their needs, which was the clearance and trees needs. So, and this is an example of that where interior material is removed for the power lines to go through. Okay, skip that. So obsolete practices, and you've probably seen these and not always realize it, that they're kind of passe now. But topping, we talked about that. I'd stay away from anybody that advertises topping on their business card or in their advertisements or recommends it as a practice for the reasons that we've been talking about. Lion tailing, that's where you take out everything in the center of the tree and you just have this tuft of branches and growth at the very top, kind of like a lollipop or a lion's tail, we call it there. And lots of different reasons. I mentioned sun skull is a possibility with lion tailing. And another thing that, aside from learning from Dr. Shigo about how a tree reacts biologically to wounding, there's now also in the past several years become a study of biomechanics, is what they call it. And that is applying physics to a tree and how it grows and how forces affect it. They actually will put a rope in a tree, they will attach a winch, and they'll have a scale in between to measure the amount of pull that's going on. And they'll pull until the tree fails. And they'll see how much energy it took to do that. And they'll experiment with that with the different shapes of the fork unions, like I mentioned, the B fork and the U fork. So the lion tailing problem with that is that you end up getting these vibrations that tend to emit winds. The frequency is much broader than if the tree had more of a canopy, and it was kind of tends to disperse the wind more. So the lion tailing will eventually, could possibly ruin the tree by it killing itself, as it were. Wound treating and painting, we talked about that. Cavity filling may still have its happiness somewhere when you're trying to encourage the tree to grow new tissue over this avoided area. However, the methods to do that are different. If you go out on an old estate, like Mount Vernon or somewhere like that, you might see cavities that almost look like bricks. Well, they were concrete, and then somebody went, they kind of formed it to make it look like a brick. But the concrete gets to be a problem because as the tree flexes, that concrete doesn't flex, so it's actually creating friction inside the trunk there. And every time you get friction or damage, that's a new spot where a wound is occurring. And you could have the fungus get in there or whatever that could be hurting it. So now more flexible types of cavity filling done, some that are actually kind of like wood pipe type of stuff that's going to be a little bit more flexible, or foams. But this is not something I would recommend a person to do on their own, but rather get some advice from somebody that's familiar with the practice of cavity filling and determine if it is or is not practical for your particular need. And then spurs, another thing. If they advertise topping, stay away. If they show up and they say, oh, we're just going to put on our spurs and climb this live tree and prune it. Well, no, you don't want that either, because every time they put a spur or a gap into the tree, they're creating a wound there, and those spur marks actually are kind of make little buckets, as it were, then moisture and fungus can settle in. So you just imagine somebody climbing your tree and making, maybe hundreds of spur marks on it. It's not going to be good for a live. For removals, yes, it's a very practical tool. You can't really hurt a tree much more than cutting it down to ground. So spurring is not going to hurt it. All right, so wound dressings, we talked about that. There actually are a couple of ones that can be used in orchard practice that help. They have hormones in them that help reduce the likelihood of all those water clouds that I talked about before. But in general terms, generally speaking, you don't use pruning sealer or pruning paint on trees for most pruning situations. Oh my goodness, there's your topping again. These are all heading cuts. They're not made at the nodes. They're not made at branch junctures. They're not good. Oh, and this is an example of that restock that I talked about, the adventitious growth of dormant buds that are released when more sunlight hits them or as a response to the wood. You can see on this one on the right, I mentioned that they're not as well attached. Well, there you have it. It won't take much to take that off. All right, and here's your line tailing again. You can see that in the center. All right, so many things to take into consideration before you prune a tree. First thing, you need to know what kind of tree it is, because it may be pruned in a different way or a different time of year than the one that's next to it. So you want to know what it is, species certainly, and then have some understanding of how it grows and why are you going to prune the tree? Is it for health? Is it for increasing the fuel? Is it for raising the branch level to make access better? Any number of reasons that you might want to prune the tree. And we've talked about the various ways you can do that. So crown cleaning, it's taking out, this crown cleaning is a pretty typical operation a tree company or arborist might use coming in on a property, and they want to get that tree back in good shape. So they'll take out excess and turn your branching. They'll take out rubbing branches, they'll take out dead branches, they'll take out a cracked or a storm damaged branch. Now, I disagree with the second one. You do sometimes remove healthy branches. Again, that's going to be like your conflicting branches, ones that are rubbing against you. They're blighted branches, but they're going to cause problem down the road. So I would take that out in that case. Crown thinning, again, to get a little more light in, the disease management of let air pass through, and structural improvements for it too. And then the crown reduction, we talked about that as an alternative to topping. And crown raising, that's basically getting more clearance. Vista pruning, thin the tree out a little bit carefully to increase the view, or maybe use a reduction cutting if you're looking over top of the tree. Restoration can be dealt with for repairing storm damage, or in the case of the tree that's been topped, you might be able to select one of the healthier water sprouts that are coming out, where you may actually go back to a proper branch cut and start from there. And then utility pruning, talk about getting clearance from utility lines. So then there's some types that don't really fit into that mold so much. And these are in landscape settings, they're aesthetic, they're interesting. This is the art side of pruning. And the first one is called a espalier, where trees are typically against a wall or the stone fence or something like that, and they're basically prunes from against that feature. And pretty neat. You see them oftentimes in like arboretums. Sometimes will have that displayed. Pollarding seems similar to topping, but it's not because it's cut back to the same general. It's like every 2 years or every year, whatever the cycle is on that. And it creates these knots. And then they do put out sprouts, they do put out that adventitious branching, but it's managed in that case. So adventitious branching never gets so big that it becomes hazardous. That will break out because it's pruned back to that knot every time it's thrown. So we talked about the differences between trees in woods, trees in your yard, and how that affects their growth patterns. We talked about proper pruning and how a branch attaches to the tree, the differences between a V-shaped juncture and a U-shaped juncture, using the right tools for the job. Forgot to tell you a little story about the right tools. I was going out through a neighborhood. I was doing some proposals for a neighbor in that location. And there had been a storm that had come through at Bradford Pear, which is a tree that self-destructs. It has bad fork units and has a lot of V-shaped forks. Well, it's common for them to get damaged by wind or ice or snow loads. And this wasn't snow or ice because it was during the summertime, if I remember correctly. But it probably was wind damage. And this poor Bradford Pear got called for it up. And here's a guy in his yard. He's going to clean up this mess. And he's got an extension cord from his house attached to his circular saw. Not that easy, usually. And I guess we'll do the job, but I was concerned for safety aspects in doing that. But, sometimes here's what you got. And improper pruning does more harm than good. We saw that as an example with the flush cuts and the rim cuts example there. And then making pruning standards, basically say, okay, we're going to do this, and we're going to use reduction cuts to bring in the side 1.5 feet in diameter, approximately. Or we're going to move dead wood 2 inches in diameter of bark. Or as we're going to raise the branch level 10 to 12 feet above ground, something like that. So define the standard before you actually start doing the job. If you're a tree owner and you're working with an arborist, then that helps you to understand what to expect. And then the arborist understands what your needs are, and that's hopefully making recommendations based on that. And that is that. I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your interest in trees, and I thank you for attending this presentation from the Front Royal Warren County Tree Stewards.